And welcome everybody to the special meeting of the Ames City Council for Tuesday night, August 31st. Welcome, Council, and those in the audience tonight. First of all, going to open up. We have some consent items to take care of. Does Council wish to pull any consent item tonight? Hearing none, entertain motion of approving consent.
Move consent. Second.
Thank you. And I might also just mention that working for an amended agenda, and consent includes 2 additional items that was posted at least 24 hours prior to the meeting. So with that, go ahead and please call a roll call, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. All right, going to move on to our main topic this evening, the workshop on climate action plan. And Council, I'm pleased to recognize we have our climate action plan supplemental input committee members in attendance tonight. I will not ask them all to introduce themselves, but we did have a list on the dais of those who are on the committee. And on behalf of Council, thank you, all of you, for agreeing to serve and to provide the opportunity to solicit input from people that you are going to be representing. And I'm sure that Deb will be talking about that, as well as our consultant. So again, thank you very much. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to Deb or Susan, one of the two.
Right. I can start.
If you want to introduce those on the panel, and then we'll get going.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. And it's exciting to be here tonight, the first meeting with the consultant for the Climate Action Plan, SSG, and you as the steering committee for the climate action planning process. So thank you for this opportunity. I do want to acknowledge there's a variety of people involved in this process. And so I just want to point out quickly some of the committees that are represented and will be involved throughout the process. We have our project team, which is sitting here in front of you, and I'll go ahead and start with Kaylee to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Kaylee Barrios-Lane. I'm the Energy Services Coordinator in Electric Administration.
I'm sorry, could you tell us your name again? I couldn't hear.
I'm Kaylee Barrios-Lane.
Kaylee?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, Council and Mayor. I'm Mary Rankin, your Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Ames.
I'm Deb Schildroth, Assistant City Manager and the project lead.
I'm Denise Hurt. I'm with Confluence Landscape Architects, and I'm acting as kind of the in-person facilitator.
Good evening, Council. Susan, Priasta, Public Information Officer.
All right. We also have our internal technical assistance team. I don't believe I see any of them in the audience tonight. Maybe they're watching the live stream. But those individuals are representing a variety of city departments. So Public Works, Parks and Recreation, Fleet and Facilities, Resource Recovery Plant, and Planning and Housing, and Water and Pollution Control. So those individuals help us in reviewing materials, providing input, and being that backup to us when we need technical expertise with the project. So we're pleased to have their involvement. They were involved with the greenhouse gas inventory as well, so we carried them over into this part of the project. And then, of course, as the mayor mentioned, our supplemental input committee, this is going to be a big part of our community engagement and outreach for this project. Their responsibility will be to meet and talk and connect with their networks for the community sectors that they're representing. We have 12 community sectors that are involved, and we really are leaning on these individuals to bring information forward to the consultants, to the steering committee, as we put this plan together and identify our emissions targets. So very important role that they are playing in this, and appreciate their time and commitment to the process. At this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Denise, and she's going to work on introductions with SSG, who they're joining us via Zoom.
Awesome. Well, I would echo your thanks, Deb, to the mayor and the council. We're excited to be here and to be a part of this project. So like I said, I'm Denise Hurt with Confluence Landscape Architects, helping the SSG team, acting as kind of the in-person facilitator. So tonight, I'm hoping what I can do is introduce the individual and they can kind of say a quick hello so their face pops up and you can kind of recognize the name and the face connection. But on the line tonight, we've got Yule Herbert with us. He's the project lead. There he is.
Hello, everyone. Good, very good to be here in this amazing format. I'm hearing sound very well and see you all very well. I'm very pleased to be here.
Great. We also have Naomi Devine. She's our engagement lead.
Hi, everyone. Really great to be here. And yeah, this technology is fantastic. So looking forward to tonight's workshop.
Great. We have Eric Frenette, who's on the technical modeling team. He may be muted. I know he's there.
Oh, I was muted. I'm here now. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here.
Great. And then in the background, Kira and Brittany are there. They're kind of helping with the technical magic. So we don't need them to introduce themselves, but they're making all of this come together. So we definitely are glad that they're joining us tonight. So as we kick off, I'd like to start with kind of the objectives of the evening. We see that there's two objectives tonight. The first is to inform the steering committee members about the objective, scope, and timeline of our project, the engagement plan for the project, talk about climate action planning and greenhouse gas emission target setting generally, and the modeling methodology that's going to be used for this project, and how and why it builds and expands on the city's recent inventory and methodology. And then the second part is really to consult the steering committee about the project's engagement plan. So this evening we'll go through a number of things. We'll start off with, I'll provide a brief overview of the evening. And then after that's complete, I'll turn it over to Naomi, who will go over our engagement plan. We'll offer a short break if anyone needs it, but from what I'm hearing, we're kind of a plow through, get it done type of group, so that may or may not happen, but we'll offer it in any case. Once Naomi kind of wraps up the engagement plan, Eric will step in and talk about our modeling process, and then Yule will talk about climate action planning and target setting. So each of those three main sections, at the end, we're going to offer a question and answer period so that we can talk about any questions you might have developed during that time. So ideally, we'd like you, if you have a question that comes up, to write it down, scribble it so you don't forget it. And then at the end of that section, we'll come back and engage with that question. And then to end it, we'll wrap up and talk about what the next steps are. So a little more detail. Why are we here today? We're here today to begin the engagement process involved in developing the city's greenhouse gas reduction target, kind of a mouthful, and the climate action plan, which will establish a path for the community to get there. Developing the greenhouse gas reduction target and the climate action plan is a dynamic process that involves both the technical modeling and community engagement. These processes will be explained in greater depth by the SSG team that I've introduced to you, but I'll provide a quick overview as well.
Denise, before you go any further, can everybody hear Denise? Because sometimes we have a problem with sound. Is everyone hearing clearly?
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you. If you have any problems hearing, sometimes we have a problem with mics or we have a little bit of a dead zone, please just wave your hand and we'll make sure that we catch them and make sure you can hear, because I think it's really important everyone understands and can hear what's being talked about. So thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll soon hear from Naomi, our engagement lead, who will be providing an overview of our draft engagement plan and seeking feedback from you. In general terms, the engagement plan will inform the greenhouse gas reduction target and the climate action plan through a process that's directed by the climate action plan steering committee, yourselves, as well as assisted by the city staff that Deb told us about, input gathered from our supplemental input committee, and community feedback, which we'll talk, Naomi will talk about how we'll gather that community feedback. Then after Naomi, Eric will step in and introduce you to the technical modeling portion of the project. The climate action plan will be built on a model of the city's business as usual. You may hear the acronym BAU, business as usual, energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. This model will help ensure that the series of actions developed via engagement and research on best practices address all of these projected emissions. Eric's going to share an update on where we are on the modeling process and an overview of the modeling methodology that will be used in this project. including how it differs from the BAU, business as usual, recently produced for the city. Finally, Yule will be discussing the science-based target setting and provide a sense of what other communities across the continent are doing. He'll also provide an overview of best practices in the community climate action planning. As a result of all of the above, and subject to any unknowns, we anticipate that this will all come together and be presented as the final climate action plan in September of 2022. There's obviously going to be a number of touch points between now and then, but just as a kind of recap on when you should expect this to kind of all come together, we're thinking then. So as you guys have kind of heard what the overview is for tonight, are there any topics you hope to address that don't appear to fall into one of those categories of what we're going to talk about? Any other questions before we dive in? Easy group. With that, I'll hand it over to Naomi.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Denise. And thank you everyone for having us this evening. We're really, as we've said, excited to be here and excited to kick off this conversation with you. I'm going to be your sort of trusted guide for the engagement process. And as was mentioned, there'll be a Q&A and sort of feedback session at the end of this. You'll probably notice that I'm a bit of a fast talker. So if you need me to repeat anything, I will not take offense to that. So please just let me know. I want to make sure that we get through the information. I understand too, you received it, of course, ahead of time. So we're going to go over the highlights this evening and happy to dive into anything more when we get to that Q&A period. So just another invitation to, if questions come up as I'm presenting, please write them down and we'll make sure that we get to them during that period. Let's go to the next slide. I like to start here, sort of what purpose does engagement serve? It's a good question to ask at the outset of a project. I find that if we don't, engagement can kind of boil down to event planning. And while events are certainly an important part of engagement, they're not the sort of substantive part of engagement in that we gather the public together to basically get public intelligence from them in order to support decision making. This steering committee and a council, of course, are the deciders at the end of the day about the climate action plan. And so this plan is designed in order to get the best public intelligence put forward for you to make the best, we together collectively make the best climate action plan possible so that you can make the strongest decision for the community possible. Let's go to the next slide. And it's important to think, I think, too, about engagement as a dial and not a switch. It's not really about on or off. It's about how much and when and for how long are sort of the guiding questions to really think about engagement. And you'll see that broken down already in the plan, and I'll sort of talk about that this evening as well, in that we're going to engage some groups more in depth for specific reasons. And we're going to engage other groups in the public with different sort of techniques and sort of to a different degree as well. And we collect all of that input at the end of the day and synthesize it in the project in order to inform the best climate action plan possible. And we'll go to the next slide. So in terms of engagement design, this engagement plan has been designed on the framework of IAB2, or the International Association of Public Participation, which is the global standard for public engagement. And in the pre-engagement process, where we have interviewed key stakeholders and worked with staff as well to sort of determine where should that dial essentially be set for the project on average, is at the involved level. And what that means on the slide here is, I'll read it out to you. It's to work directly with the public throughout the process to ensure that public concerns and aspirations are consistently understood and considered. And so IAP2 talks about that as the goal, sort of level for which part of the spectrum essentially that we're on. And when you go from left to right, it's about increasing the amount of influence that the public can have essentially on a decision. The promise to the public at the involved level is that we will work with you to ensure that your concerns and aspirations are directly reflected in the alternatives developed, and provide feedback on how the public input did influence the decision at the end of the day. So it's often commonly referred to as what we heard reports, sort of our issues sort of throughout a project or at the end as well, to show here's the engagement technique essentially that we used, here's who's participated, here's the feedback we received, and here's how we incorporated it or didn't. In some particular cases, you can receive feedback, of course, that is out of scope, but good to know about, and we would also account for it that way. So this is the general average level for the project. Like I said, with the dial examples, for some things, we might go up to the level of collaborate, and certainly the steering committee that we're here with tonight fits that level. And others, for different techniques, you'll see in the engagement plan that we've already set out, are at the consult level, but most happen to fall and involve. And that didn't just come from us, deciding that on a whim. It came from the key engagement interview process, getting a sense from those key informants where how important they felt engagement was to this particular project. And we went through an evaluation process with staff where we ask a standardized set of questions and then score it to find out where is the best level. And the good news is, the bottom line is that what the public was telling us initially already, like who we talked to and the staff, it arrived at the same place. And that's a really good sign. We can go to the next slide now. So that pre-engagement report I've been talking about, what we did is we asked the city for names of people who would be willing to participate in a pre-engagement interview process that's confidential. So that allows us to sort of start the planning process with a certain level of neutrality going into it. So from that list, we chose representatives from local businesses, including owners and individuals who are in leadership roles, representatives of nonprofit and civic organizations, a student, and 2 individuals representing themselves in the capacity as residents of Ames to start to tell us or answer important questions about not only climate action planning, what they would like to see in the plan, any types of concerns or unknowns that we should know about, how best to engage residents of Ames. Is there anything to learn from other types of engagement so we avoid any sort of missteps and don't repeat anything that they've seen that they don't like in the past? How to best communicate with everyone in Ames? And then a general question of, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us? And is there anybody else that we should be speaking to get a real sense of having enough input at the front end of the report to know that we were putting together an engagement that's going to best fit Ames itself. Let's go to the next slide. And in terms of what the key themes were when we did the analysis, that will pop up in just a minute. Oh, I'm not sure where that slide went. There we go. There were some key recommendations that came out of this that we used to write the engagement plan itself. Essentially, they fell under these themes: engage a broad and a cross section of the community, use a variety of engagement methods when doing so. One particular person that I interviewed was very keen on having pub night discussions about climate action. So it was an interesting suggestion. We want clear, relatable, and ongoing communication, and you'll see some forms of that as well as we get deeper into the presentation, how we've addressed that. And tap into the networks of local organizations and individuals. And certainly how we've set up the steering committee and the supplemental input committee are part of the answer to that recommendation as well. We hope that everyone who's participating on those committees, of course, become champions for the climate action plan and help carry the message forward about how others can participate if they'd like to. Next slide. So basically, in terms of the engagement design, moving with that IAP2 framework, setting the sort of level of engagement to be expected at with each technique, and speaking to members of the public, that helps give us a good foundation to write the engagement plan. And in the mix too, or another ingredient, of course, are the techniques, of course, that the city itself also requested. So we made sure that they were in there. Next slide. Who are these stakeholders that are sort of really close essentially to the plan that we've identified? So as you've heard before, the supplemental input committee consisting of community stakeholders from various sectors chosen by the city. They've come to us through an application process. The city steering committee itself, so that's this body, and the city technical advisory committee. So that consists of the assistant city manager, the head of city communications, Iowa State University head of sustainability, the Ames Utility Energy Services coordinator, as well as representatives from across city departments, of course, as needed. Next slide, please. So boiling down to the engagement plan itself, sort of divided into 2 key things: the engagement objectives themselves, and sort of several techniques that we've chosen help us achieve those, and that's our strategy. And strategy comes, of course, before tactics, and then the engagement techniques are the tactics themselves. So let's take a quick look at the objectives. We'll review those. So objective 1 is really an inform objective. And so we kick off every engagement project with an inform objective. It's the first level on that IAP2 spectrum from the slide that we saw a little while back. Because of course you can communicate without engaging, but you can't engage without communicating. So this sort of makes sure we start off a project where everyone knows how they can participate, what they're participating in, and hopefully they become really enthusiastic about wanting to participate. The second objective is, again, you see that involve level. So that's us working in that IAP2 level, stakeholders in the development of the engagement process. And we did that with the pre-engagement report, and facilitate inclusive conversations among stakeholders in order to document community concerns and aspirations. So this objective still applies to the committees that we formed throughout the project as well. It's not just limited to pre-engagement. Next slide, please. Objective 3 is to involve the community and city staff in gathering feedback that will inform the community's greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, and you'll hear more about that later on from my colleagues. The selected low carbon actions and the climate action plan's near-term implementation strategy. The implementation is where the fun really begins. And the final objective is to inform stakeholders of how their involvement shaped the plan. So we end every process with going back to stakeholders. So just like we inform at the beginning, we go back at the end and we meet that promise that was mentioned in the IAP2 framework to let the public know how their input did in fact shape the final plan. Let's move on to tactics. Okay, so techniques that we've already sort of moved on and have mentioned are pre-engagement interviews in the report and the engagement plan design, which we're still in that phase. So we're going to be taking feedback from you tonight on the engagement plan design, and that'll help us arrive at the final engagement plan. The next phase is the active engagement period. There's a lot of things here, so let me just read them out for you. These are all of the tactics that we have chosen from the process that I've discussed so far. So focus groups with key stakeholders, and we've started to have some of those discussions with folks that have been recommended to us, and we'll continue to have those as necessary throughout the project. And in fact, this committee or the Supplemental Input Committee could recommend to us further focus groups or people to have focused discussions with. We have an interactive website. We're going to take a sneak peek at that this evening behind the scenes so you can see what we've been working on as well. There's the City Steering Committee Workshop 1, and there's several workshops in here with the steering committee. The first one is this one, which is about the process overall. And then the Supplemental Input Committee's first workshop will go over the base year and the BAU results, that business as usual acronym that we've mentioned before, and we'll talk about target setting with them. We will have a launch event in the form of a town hall that will also cover the climate action plan inventory and business as usual. So you start to see the same type of information, of course, appearing across different techniques. We want to make sure that everyone has access to the same level of information so that when they're providing input, we're all starting from the same page. We go into another workshop with the Supplemental Input Committee, and that's the next phase in the process is when actions start to appear on the scene. We need to get feedback to make sure that those actions are as customized for AIMS as they should be. Same thing for the workshop with the steering committee as well. They'll review feedback to date. They'll get more information on target setting, what groups in the public have told us so far in the process, what people are thinking about low carbon actions, and we'll want to hear from this committee about what you think about low carbon actions as well, and have that low carbon action workshop. We have a workshop for both of those committees on low carbon scenario modeling results and an introduction to implementation, what that transition starts to look like. They're listed together here, but I just wanted to note, and we'll make this reflected in the final engagement plan, those will be two separate workshops as well. We will be conducting a community survey as we get closer to implementation to get the wider public's feedback on implementation and their readiness for implementation. And then the final workshops that we'll have will be low carbon financial results and implementation part 2. There will be an online opportunity for people to provide, members of AIMS to provide feedback on the plan itself near the end of the process. And we will also be creating at the consult level town hall and kitchen table conversation workbooks. So essentially almost like a workshop in a box that members of the public can take and conduct on their own. And they'll have feedback mechanisms in them that feed back into the process to make sure that their input helps shape the final plan. It's a lot to cover in the active engagement period. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly. But like I mentioned, we're coming up soon to the Q&A section. Next slide, please. Phase 3, nice and short. It'll be the final presentation and report, of course, to council as well to wrap up the project. And in that report, too, we will talk about how the public's feedback was incorporated and how it shaped the final outcome. Next slide. All right, so Kira's going to queue up the draft website that we have. We'll take a quick look at that, and then it's time for question and answer. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. So essentially, we've created a scrolling website for the climate action plan, and it will also link directly back to AIMS's sustainability website. And at the top there, if you just pause for a second there, Kira, for me, you'll see right from the top, people can jump to the project schedule itself, any upcoming events. There'll be a frequently asked questions section, of course, and that will continue to get updated as we find out the questions that are most on the public's mind as we go through the project. Any documents that are relevant. So when the BAU, modeling results come out, for example, things like that will appear on the website as well for anyone to be able to take a look at. And then contact information for when people want to reach out to us and provide feedback, perhaps in another way, just, direct email, for example, can also, we'd also love to hear feedback, of course, that way as the project continues to roll out. And we'll just get you to scroll down there too, Kira, and you can see sort of how this rolls out. Stay informed and sign up is near the top, of course, for people to sign up and be part of a newsletter to be informed about the project as it rolls out and opportunities for them to provide input. We've got the timeline there as well. You've seen a version of it already this evening for everyone to see. And then we've got the events calendar baked right into the website so people can see any upcoming events if they'd like to participate and add them to their own calendars, or past engagement events essentially that we've had. An opportunity to learn more about the climate action plan itself. And here's that frequently asked questions section. So we've already got some of that seated as well. And those are all drop downs. So if you click on one, the answer will appear. There we go. Thank you. Perfect. And then I think we're near the end. I think the documents and then contact information essentially are there. And we, of course, would welcome your feedback on this website too, and anything else that you might like to see on it. Now, if I haven't spoken too quickly, that concludes the presentation portion of my part of the meeting, and it's over to question and answer and feedback. And so I'd like to turn it back over to you, and happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you for your time.
Questions from council?
A question for Mary. So if our goal is to have this completed by this, September of 2022, that's a fairly long ways away. If there is a suggestion that you think is important for the city to consider before we adopt the plan formally, we can always do that, can't we? So we're not precluded. We don't have to wait until the plan has been formally adopted. If there's something good, and we would continue to rely on you as our sort of our main source of counsel on these matters. So if I think I speak for the council, we certainly don't want to wait. If there's an idea that emerges that's a best practice in communities around the country that we should be adopting, feel free to propose that for our consideration.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. I guess these are probably for Naomi. The first question I have is, how are we ensuring, to the best of our ability, that underrepresented members of the community are engaged in the input and encouraged to offer their input? Is that on the supplemental input committee? Is it the city? Is it your team? Who's focusing on getting the people to the table who don't usually come to the table?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. The answer is, to some degree, each of those groups, but in terms of practically, that was part of the process right from pre-engagement, is that we ask about who else should be at the table, who perhaps isn't here. We asked for a good cross-section of key stakeholders as well, right at the beginning of the process, but it doesn't end there. That's one of the reasons too why we have additional potential focus group or focus conversations, to make sure that if we find that by design on the supplemental input committee, for example, and who they reach out to, we're still not hearing from underrepresented groups and names, that we would then launch another sort of form of engagement to make sure that we hear those voices and include them in the process. So it's a key part of the process, and I think we've got multiple ways to sort of handle that, not just at one particular point in the process.
Okay, and following on from that, one of the difficult groups for us to get involved is Iowa State University students, because they're busy with their courses and everything else. And we do have some student representation on our supplemental input committee, but the timeline takes us until next September, and the students are gone, or many of them leave town between May and August. So are there key elements of this input process and feedback that occur when the students are not in the community?
I think in terms of the engagement process is designed to sort of also give input to all the milestones within the technical process as well. So some of it's just dependent on the technical process and what's happening there. In the event though that we had, say, let's just say it was action planning time, and that happened to fall for reasons of project management into a time when the students wouldn't be here, we have other engagement techniques that we can put out that would get their feedback on those types of actions while they were still around, to make sure that we actually got them and got their feedback into the process, regardless of when that's going to happen in the technical rollout, sort of the project. So it's really about kind of constantly having your finger on the pulse of where we're at with how that process is going, and where members of the community are, that we want to make sure that their voices are represented in the plan. So we can adapt and adjust, I guess, is the bottom line to that, and make sure that we get the input from students in a timely manner, and aren't actually are at a key point in the project and can't get their feedback, just because they're not around. So we can work it so that we can get their feedback while they're around.
Great. And one last question. This is more nuts and bolts. What form will the community survey take? Is that an online survey? Is that coming out in multiple forms? Hard copy? What is it?
Yeah, well, we would take direction from the steering committee and the supplemental input committee on the best form. It generally is online, but we've also had hybrid forms where we do have paper versions. So when pre-COVID, when we could appear more at in-person events, that would be another pathway to getting input into a survey, where you can fill it out on paper, and then that gets entered into the survey online itself to capture all of those responses. Or you can go with tablets and computers to other events as well, where there's the internet, of course. Where there isn't, we can go analog, and have all of that collected in one place online, whether it's input manually or, of course, people are participating online. The level of detail about specifically like that is what sort of comes next after we adopt the engagement plan, is that we make sure that we take that survey and we deploy it in the community in ways that make the most amount of sense. So we're not fixed or rigid in the way that we put that out there.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
Other questions? I have several. First of all, on your website, I presume it's still in a work in progress. I didn't see anything that said how to leave input, or for the community to enter their thoughts or questions or opinions. Did I miss that? Or is that something that's going to still be put in? Or is that not part and parcel of the purpose of the website?
We have a sort of how you can get involved, which is a bit more prominent. And I think what we could do is we could make the contact sort of section of the website also more explicit around leaving your input that way. I think that might address that. How does that sound?
Well, I'll share that we've had several plans we've gone through in the last few years. And I will say there's been a very robust engagement process where people do leave a lot of comments. So that might be, I'll leave that to staff to kind of, parse through that. But I think that's something that we might be a missed opportunity for capturing people's, thoughts or feedback in the process.
Yeah, we will make sure that the website reflects that.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, under your engagement slide, I know council's just excited about this input committee that is represented here, I think in majority tonight. And they're really going to play a key role in helping us, reach a broad cross section. I mean, they're going to be asked to go out and contact people from, different faith communities, if they're in that group, or a business community, or whatever. So my question is, how do you assist or help lead them in the engagement and education process? How does SSG or Confluence, because they might not know how to go about doing it, and what kind of questions or input are you looking for them to provide?
It's our secret goal to turn everybody into engagement specialists by the time we're done with every community that we work with. It's a really great question, and we would have that discussion, I think, in meeting. So as the opportunities arise and we need the supplemental input committee to, use their influence and their speak to their connections and their networks about opportunities, we would work with or coach anyone, sort of through that. Some people, I think, are natural at it and have a lot of experience at it, and we recognize too, not everybody does. So we also prepare materials as necessary too. So if there was almost like a frequently asked questions for engagement kind of thing too, we could produce something like that, for example, and make sure that the members of the committee had what they needed so that they felt comfortable making the asks and sharing the materials that they need. Part of that too is making sure that we have the tools that we've already currently set up, like the website, also reflecting the needs of the committee, both committees, as well. And of course, hearing from the public about what they most want to hear about, as we go through the process. So we sort of handle that in each community as they identify with us what their needs essentially are. But so a lot of things are open to us, but that's a conversation that we would have openly with the committee itself to find out what their needs were.
So if I think I heard you, that is, so you'll help lead them in that process, provide materials, do some coaching, and also what some expectations are. You'll help them with that. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Great. And then the last one, this is maybe getting in the weeds, but in your in phase 2, I think the first workshop, can you go back that slide, Susan, by any chance? There's a slide for phase, or someone else's. You're not, you can't do it. There you go. All right. Under the 1, 2, 3, 4, workshop 1, this is base year and BAU results and target setting workshop. Can you explain what goes on in target setting?
Yeah, where we have a discussion, essentially what we do is we review, and we're going to, I think you might be mentioning this evening, but I hope I haven't stepped on his toes here. What we do is we essentially review the role of target setting itself in a climate action planning process, what targets currently look like, both in the United States and around the world, and of course nearby places as well that are relevant. And then we talk about the importance of science-based target setting as well, in order to talk about what's the most appropriate low carbon target for Ames itself. So there's a lot of information sharing that happens in a discussion like that, and sort of to take the temperature of where we're at with how ambitious the community wants to be in setting the plan. The target itself, of course, is really important because it helps us shape to what degree the actions themselves need to be reduced in each sort of sector in order to hit that target. So it's a big North Star. It's a big important conversation, and it involves a lot of information sharing. I hope, is that specific enough for you at this stage, would you say?
I think so. I just the big question, big picture is, I know my perception, I'm not that well versed yet. I'm learning, but it seemed like the target is going to be a very important piece that's going to be set.
Yep.
And you're going to be using that for a lot of decision making.
And it's not just in that particular committee, that conversation will take place, as well. So it can happen in multiple places, but it certainly does need to happen there, and with this steering committee as well. To make sure that we're on the right track with the target setting itself, and understanding the implications of different targets in setting those, as well. So understanding the difference between those potential choices.
Yeah, I was trying to tease out, is that being decided early on, absent a lot of other information like financial implications, feedback from the community? I just didn't know when it says target setting workshop, if that was something that it was expected early on a target was going to be set by either the, certainly I think it's the steering committee's responsibility to ultimately make that decision, but I was just curious on that. So
I think, I'm not sure I heard the first part of that. There was a bit of audio interference at the first part of your question. Would it be possible to repeat it? I want to make sure that I understood it correctly.
Sorry. I have a good memory, but it's really short. I think.
Was it about timing of the selection of the target, or was it more than that?
Yeah, I think I'll just withdraw the question at this point in time, not because I'm frustrated. I think it'll probably be answered later on. So anyway.
If I could step in and ask.
Thanks, David.
Sure.
I'm sort of interested in this as well. I think the way I look at it, it's reasonable to think of the process as culminating in a target setting, rather than having that sort of be something that is developed early on, and then we talk about all the consequences for a long time, and then we ask people after it's all done, does this seem okay to you? Right, so is that what we're actually looking at here? Are we going to be equipped to understand the consequences of setting the target sort of midway through the process?
Yeah, that's a great way to open up that discussion. It doesn't have to be set right then. That's when we're going to kick off the discussion of target setting and all of its implications. And from there, the committee is well positioned to tell us, are you ready to select a target? Is it something that you would like additional feedback on? How would you like to sort of have this conversation moving forward? So we don't expect to have, perhaps maybe that's what it looks like in the plan. We don't expect necessarily to have a target at that stage. Some communities are ready to have a target. They walk into this process and already have decided what target that they want to set and have that discussion with us, and we sort of go from there. Other communities like to conduct the discussion differently, and it's just about what's most appropriate for your community. And we need that from you. That's part of the engagement process, is that we need to hear from you about how to appropriately have that sensitive discussion. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Dave. You said in a few words while I was stumbling around, so thank you. Closing comment, I just thank you for what I think is a very detailed and well thought out plan for engagement. For those who may be interested, this is on the city's website. It's underneath, it's a council packet, but there is probably a half dozen pages or more just dedicated to this phase 2. And so I think it's a great roadmap. So thank you for putting that together for us. Any further questions? Any further questions for Naomi, or we're going to go ahead and move on to the next item?
That's great. I think that's all for me. We had a break scheduled next, and actually that's good timing. We're just about 3 minutes, I think, over for what we had for engagement. So I thank you very much for your comments. We would, of course, welcome more comments and feedback outside of this meeting, should you have them. And I think we've got time for about a 5-minute break.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, I think we'll just keep on going on. We're used to going about 2 hours before we take a break. So maybe in Canada you take more breaks, but
we're all about the easy life, yeah, up here.
All right.
We're of course fine to continue on. So I will throw it back to Denise and up for the modeling session. I think Eric's coming up.
Yeah. Thanks, Naomi. Looks like for modeling method and process, Eric is on board.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. Thanks, Denise. You can go to the next slide, Kara, please. Here we have the basic schedule of the different phases in modeling the project. So I'll go through each one. First, we start with data collection, which is basically all the data we need for input for the variables in the model and for each sector, so transportation, residential, non-residential, waste, and so on. This process is complete. So far, we've received a lot of very detailed and good quality data, so that went very well. And then the next stage in the modeling process is the calibrated base year. So this is where we're using the base year of 2018, which lines up with your recent inventory for 2018. And we're calibrating the model to that year for all the sectors to either match everything we're seeing in the AIMS inventory, or if there are differences, then highlight those differences and see why there are differences. And then the next stage is reference modeling, which we refer to as business as usual, or you'll see BAU modeling a lot. We're currently working on the assumptions for this. So this is basically where we want to see what the picture looks like in the future. So we start in 2018, and then we go all the way to 2050, incorporate city-specific plans, different policies, how those shape the results in the future, and get a simulation for the city. And this has also been done as part of the 2018 inventory. So we will, in the next section here, highlight the differences our model brings compared to what has been done. And then after this stage, the fourth stage is the low carbon scenario modeling. So this is where we take all the input and ideas for how to reduce greenhouse gases by sector and target different actions for different years of how to reduce those emissions and see what the impacts are for each sector. And finally, once that is done, we do financial analysis. So we look at the cost of each of these actions, when they're coming in, the financing for them. Basically, you'll have one action might be to increase the number of electric vehicles by a significant margin. There'll be a cost associated to that. There'll be savings for fuel. There'll be lots of implications. And for each action, we'll do that type of analysis. Next slide, please.
Okay. Bill, can you, or Susan, can we see if we can, I think, Eric, your audio is a little muffled, and we're having a bit a transmission problem too, so. Why don't you just pause for a second. We'll see if we can get something done on our side too. It's being broadcast through an owl here. And and so maybe it's not as good.
Is it a bit clearer now?
It's muffled in terms of the expert just walked in. Okay, go ahead and try again, Eric.
Okay, can you hear me clear?
Is that better? So, but I think we're gonna, maybe it's your headset too, I don't know, but.
It's clear on the Zoom side. Just, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it is coming through clear on here.
Here are suggestions, Bill. You get closer to a mic, would that help, or would that get feedback?
No, it's him. I would say, and just speak up if you can, too, into your mic.
So I'll try just speaking louder.
There
Is
you
that what I'm
go.
hearing?
All right, everyone's heads start going, oh, yeah. So you hit the nail on the head there. Good. All right, let's go.
It's working now?
You sound much better, yes.
Okay, perfect. There we go. Was the first part clear enough, or would it be worth it for me to recap the first part?
If you wouldn't mind, if you go back to the other slide and just give a quick recap
Sure.
versus.
I'll give a quick recap, sure.
Thank you.
Previous slide, please. Okay, so, there we go. So the basic idea here is to show the different phases of the modeling throughout the project. And we start with data collection, all the input we need for the different variables. Then we calibrate the model to the base year, which is 2018, which lines up with the AIMS 2018 inventory, and we compare it to that inventory. Next is reference modeling, or also called business as usual modeling, where we look at the projection of and the impact of current plans and policies that are planned for the future in AIMS, and we'll compare that to the BAU that was also done recently. And fourth is the low carbon scenario modeling, where we look at different actions that will reduce greenhouse gases. And finally, we look at the financial impacts of all of this modeling.
And it's probably been said, what does E and E stand for? I'm sorry if I missed it.
Yeah, so it's alternative energy and emission scenarios.
Energy and emission. Thank you.
And one other question as we go along. To what degree is this approach standardized? So there are different consultants doing this kind of work. Is there a best practices for this kind of modeling?
Well, I would say like this is the standard approach where you have the calibrated base year and then you have a reference scenario, business as usual. It's very standard where we want to look at the trajectory of emissions and energy. If things stay relatively the same, or if we incorporate some of the plans that are currently in motion, and then contrast that to what we need to do. Yul, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, there is an accounting protocol that is standardized across all cities internationally now called the GHG Protocol for Community Scale GHG Inventories. And so that protocol underlies this modeling effort. Models themselves vary quite a lot depending on the consultant. And we, of course, have the very best one.
Okay, let's let Eric finish his presentation, then we'll have questions and answers after that then. So go ahead, Eric.
Okay. Sounds good. Next slide, please, Kira. Perfect. So here's a few key differences with the current business as usual scenario that was completed as part of the 2018 inventory. So we looked at the differences in assumptions and just the actual model itself and how that is different. So here are the key points. Number one, we're using in our model much higher resolution data, meaning greater detail. For one example of that is that we're modeling each traffic zone. So there are over 500 traffic zones in Ames, and we have buildings data, energy data, emissions, transportation data for each one of those. So it's a very highly detailed spatial model. And we're also using transportation data from the Ames transportation model, which was not used for the previous BAU. So we're getting actual model trips and behavior, and including your model outputs into our model. Next key point is we're including more of Ames's future plans. The big one, the main one that has the biggest impact, that will make the biggest difference, is the coal phase out at ISU, which is planned for to be done by 2024. This is basically, the plan is to replace the coal-fired boilers at the CHP system at the university by natural gas, and that should reduce emissions by about 35%. So pretty significant reduction, and the university is a very big part of the energy and emissions profile for the city. The third point is we have a bit more integration to our different sectors, and what I mean by that is there's more links between different sectors and feedbacks between them. So it's a very rich model where it's very detailed data, and there's lots of links between different variables. One example of this is we're using projections for new buildings in different zones, and depending where those new buildings are, let's say they're dwellings, people will, let's say it's their house, they'll travel from their house, and the way they travel will be influenced by what we know about transportation in that zone currently and what it is in the future. So for example, if there's more transit, there's access to transit in that zone, and we're adding more houses in that zone, our model takes that into account. That's just one example, but there's many different links like this in the model. And the last one is realistic physical constraints. So our model is stocks and flow models. It's very much based in physical variables. So you have stocks of vehicles, and they turn over at a certain rate every year. You get new vehicles, you get vehicles that retire at their end of life. And this adds another level of realism to the model, where you can't just switch a vehicle stock in 1 year or in a few years. There was some of that in the previous BAU that I've noticed. I think our model takes it a level deeper, because for every year we have new vehicles being purchased, and we have old vehicles being retired, and so on for residential buildings, for non-residential, and for many of the sectors. Next slide, please. Here we go. So here's a kind of guided tour to through the model. It's a very, very big model, lots of different variables, and this kind of sums the relationships between the main sectors and the main components. Yeah, you can go forward one, please. So the main output we're concerned with is, first of all, energy use, and then greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the final output of the model, and the emissions are based on different fuels used, different energy use, and other non-fuel variables also, like agriculture and so on. So that's the main output. And if we go all the way to the left, there we go. The main driver for all of this is it begins with very detailed population and household data. So we have population for each traffic zone, households for each traffic zone, and population demographic details such as age, as we see here. Next one, please. Here, we'll look at the residential buildings, which are represented in each traffic zone. And if you zoom into here, you'll see the detail in the different archetypes we have for each residential building. So we don't only have dwellings or detached and apartments. We have very detailed archetypes to represent each type of building. Oh, okay, here's good. Here we see that these aren't the Ames traffic zones, but we see an example of different traffic zones with different dwelling details. So where single, doubles, rows, or apartments are located. So it's just another example of the spatial aspect to the model. All of this detail on the building stock and the residential building stock and population leads us to residential energy use. And here we also model the stock of different systems in the dwellings. So for space conditioning, so for heating and cooling, water heating, plug load, lighting, and appliances. So heating systems, we have a bunch of different technologies. I won't go through all of them. Same thing for air conditioners and water heaters. So each type of system has its own set of unique technologies. And here we see this 3D graph, which just an example of the detail where you'll have these different residential building archetypes and different technologies for each of these archetypes. And this, you can add another dimension to this, which would be by each traffic zone, we would know this. And then for every year and time also, we would know this. It's a similar picture for non-residential buildings as residential buildings. The archetypes are different to represent each of the types of non-residential buildings, and those are also situated by traffic zone. Here we go. Oh, no, that was good. Thank you. So we have, once we have the population, we also model the actual stock of personal use vehicles. So we'll use average, on average, how many vehicles there are per dwelling. We model the transit system, and we have employment data. We can combine those to have a detailed representation of passenger transportation and energy use. So here we see different variables that go into that. We have the number of trips. We have the different mode shares if people bike, walk, use transit, use their car, the average trip length, and so on. And we use all of these, and all of these are also by traffic zone. Another important sector is waste. So we model the different processes that have to do with solid waste and wastewater. So if it's incinerated, if it goes to anaerobic digester, if it's composted, we represent all of that. For Ames, we have combustion because of the waste to energy plant, so we're representing that. And for wastewater, we have some anaerobic digestion too, so we're representing that in our model. Another important aspect, especially for this project, is local energy production. So here we see the different technologies, and if you go one more, please. So this has to do with the district energy and CHPs. We know there's a very big one at the university, uses a lot of energy and provides heat and power, heat for the campus. And we've modeled that for the calibration, and we'll definitely have actions relating to that later on. And the final three, which I won't go into detail into, are commercial transportation, industrial process emissions, and agricultural emissions. And that gives us our whole picture from beginning to end. And that's it for the presentation part of the modeling. So now should be the question and answer period. There we go.
Thank you, Eric. Questions or comments from?
I do have a few questions.
Go ahead, David.
Hey, so first, I understand that this is your proprietary model, at least some of it is. So the question is, how much would you consider to be relatively standard in the modeling world, and how much is your proprietary addition? Can you quantify that somehow?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think how it's designed, there's definitely something unique to it, but I think stock and flow models have been around for a long time. So that aspect of it is pretty standard, where you have year-to-year physical stocks and you have turnover and you have big demographic variables like population and employment. And through those demographic variables and the different stocks, you get your whole story. As opposed to another popular model type would be an optimization model, which would be different than this, where you're optimizing some kind of equation. This is different because it's a stocks and flow model.
Okay, thank you. And given that it's at least somewhat proprietary, what would you say in order to explain to someone that this model has been adequately tested for use and application in the real world?
That's a very good question. Well, I would say just based on the number of test cases or projects we've done with it, but maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I actually just jumping in on the proprietary piece. We've actually made the commitment that it's open source.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
It's somewhat helpful, I would say. The problem, like we've actually tried to share it with a number of people, and it's a bit complicated. So it actually takes, even though it's open source, the barrier to entry is quite high, which has been a piece that we've really been grappling with. But we have applied it to probably 100 municipalities now, of all sizes, from 10,000 people to 2.8 million. And I think the most interesting one was actually the 10,000 person one, because it was so close to the ground that you could really see where it wasn't right and where it was right. So because if you didn't get that house over in the corner right, the representation of the energy became very obvious very quickly, because there's not that many houses or not that many commercial buildings. So I think we have, there's a sort of an old adage in our world that's all models are wrong and some models are useful. So I think we're pretty clear that this is a useful model. It's been quite transformative for many municipalities. So while we're dealing with the future, which is inherently uncertain, it does give you a lot of useful information about thinking about cause and effect between different land use decisions or technological decisions, and how those will impact your energy and emissions and finances in the future. So it's very powerful for thinking about the future, I think. At least in our
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Other questions, David?
No, thanks.
I was intrigued to see that you have included the ISU coal phase out as part of this, and also I think there's some implications that ISU is being used in the model. So my question is, if ISU is being included in the model, what role will they play in terms of discussions on targets and some of the projects or improvements that would be proposed? Because they're really, and no disrespect, Mary, but the point is they're really not at the table as a official stakeholder. It's more like, I thought it was more for the city, but obviously Iowa State is a key player in that. So maybe you can share with us how that's going to work, because obviously they're a big consumer and a user. And so can you kind of talk us through that?
Well,
maybe, would you mind, could you
go
take your mask off?
sure.
So it's easier for us to hear. Thank you.
No worries. So I guess my consideration would be, this is something that Iowa State has planned. It's within their sustainability plan, within their actions that they, are going to be implementing on a time schedule. I would consider this along the same manner as if our business community, for example, had also made a commitment that we were aware of, we knew was going to be a part of what was going to impact the community's greenhouse gas emissions, and that future modeling, and have incorporated it in that manner.
Okay. Well, maybe it's a hard question to answer tonight, but given the fact that there's a lot of stuff being inputted into the model that
Sure.
and the reiteration or the iterations are going to be going through in terms of changes, those changes may be, I think, probably include things on campus. And if decisions have to be made, I just wondered, are you empowered to say Iowa State will commit to doing that, or how does that work? Is that
It's a much wider discussion than from me.
yeah? And so I just it's not like I don't want them at the table. It's just they're not. Doesn't seem to really be at the table right now. And so in terms of being either behind the dais or part of the conversation, so maybe something we can talk about later as you go down this path. But
well, I might add one component. I know that related to the modeling discussions and related to the general consideration of what the sort of the state of climate action is within the community. There's been a lot of engagement with Iowa State in those discussions with the consultants and also in the data gathering. So I feel that there's been a lot of that interaction and that consideration. Of course, we have 3 representatives appointed, including our utilities director, on the supplemental input committee as well. But I think I could easily speak, for administration at Iowa State in saying that any discussions that, we would need to be involved in and whoever would need to be involved in those, happy to do that.
yeah, I think as we go along, I think it's going to be important to, just keep that, open. And the same question is for SciRide too. Obviously, we have almost 90 or 100 buses, I believe, in our, public transportation system. And my guess is that's probably going to be one of the things they're going to pinpoint that, could be ways to reduce, our greenhouse gases. So anyway, I know this is a kickoff meeting, but I just thought I'd mention this. I think it's important that we know who should be at the table, having conversations and evaluating things. And all I know is in my conversation with Dr. Winterstein, I never communicated to her that and didn't really envision that it would be at this particular point. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. It's just more or less I can certainly update her on that, and you can do the same as well too. But I think it's
right. Absolutely. I mean, as you all know, my appointment is shared, between the city and the university.
Yep.
So I consider myself in an informational role on both of those.
Mary, you might want to take a look at the university or the Iowa City Climate Action Plan.
Mm-hmm.
I have looked at that, but it's been long enough ago. I don't remember if the University of Iowa was at the table in that, but that would be sort of an interesting data point to see if they participated in the Iowa City Climate Action Plan in a meaningful way. We would certainly invite that. The other point, John, and I think your point's well taken, it's not just an issue of data gathering and some policy, but I hope that we are able to do some really innovative projects with Iowa State. And this is jumping ahead, but I am particularly interested in carbon sequestration. And Iowa State is on the cutting edge of some major carbon sequestration. Wouldn't that be cool if we were able to do some partnering with them and really help move the needle? So several different levels where I hope Iowa State is critically involved.
Absolutely.
And how about the DOT? Obviously, we're the headquarters of all the transportation. All the trucks, a lot of trucks go out snow plowing and maintenance. Is that part and parcel of this, or is that excluded from the evaluation, or do you know?
They used that information in the SSG in their data gathering. They looked at all the sustainability measures and efforts that the city already is engaged with. And those were counted as well in the GHG, the greenhouse gas inventory.
So the Iowa Department of Transportation, all the orange trucks.
I'm sorry. No, the city trucks. the city trucks that have been converted to the biodiesel and
Right.
electric vehicles.
But we're not including the Iowa Department of Transportation vehicles in this, even though they do a lot of, they come and go a lot.
Correct. We're not including them.
Well, don't they model truck traffic though throughout the city from non-city vehicles?
Yes.
So it would be included in essence.
I think I will ask Eric, since he was involved with the data collection to respond to that. But we know we don't have jurisdiction, of course,
Right.
over the DOT and what they're doing. But if Eric wants to answer that question, I think David has a question as well.
Yep. So we estimate the external trips coming to Ames, and those are included. So for both personal use and commercial vehicles.
They model it.
David, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have a couple more questions. First, we discussed this during the greenhouse gas inventory phase, but can you just confirm that the work that you're doing will adhere to the ICLEI global protocols for compatibility with other sorts of use of this data in the long run? Is that what we should expect?
I'm familiar with the GPC protocols. You have to know if that's.
Yeah, that's ICLEI. So it's actually the same thing.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah. So we do use the same, we call it ICLEI, but
okay.
I don't know if that's, it's probably the same thing. But yeah, the GHG protocol is the standard sort of platform that everyone uses internationally now.
Okay, good. And another question, it's really kind of a high level question, but it might get at some of the discussion earlier. So there are some inputs in this model that we could consider things that we might not have the capacity to change at all. For example, the conversion of a power plant from one form to another. Can you just sort of speak to what's the value of modeling that sort of thing when we just don't feel like it's a variable that we can control?
That's interesting. So is that it's in this example, like the CHP at ISU would be an example of this? Where,
that would be an example, yes.
Right. So we'll model the reference case plans to get our business as usual trajectory. And then we use that to compare the low carbon actions against that. And you'll see, even though that one might stay fixed, we'll still get a global portrait of like the ISU financial picture and global financial. So it'll really influence the financial part of the piece.
I guess, for their modeling.
Okay, good. And it's also true that we might be able to then compare the magnitude of changes that we do have discretion over, or maybe have discretion over, against some of these possibly bigger things that are fixed.
Yeah.
So it gives us some perspective, right?
I think that's one of the biggest values of the model, is to put all of these things into perspective at a high level and see what the big pieces are, where you have room to move, where it might be trickier for different reasons. So definitely that's what we'll provide.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Rachel?
I have a question about the residential energy use and non-residential building energy use. So you showed a bunch of the different categories that the buildings are in. Are the age and condition of those buildings factored in too? Because I know that plays a big role in energy usage, and there's a big variety of different, single family homes, for example, in the community.
Yep, that's a very good question. So the condition, not directly, but we do have the age for each of the buildings, which is a proxy for the condition also at the same time. So they'll have typically lower energy performance than newer buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Eric. Move on to your next topic.
Thank you for the great questions.
Great. Yul, I think you're up.
Awesome. So I'm actually going to give you a little more background on the target setting question. I think hopefully give a bit more context and support more discussions later on. So if you go to the next slide, climate action planning is a really fun discipline. I think you're starting to get a sense of that because it touches on everything. And well, it's fun and challenging because we're looking at land use planning, we're looking at engineering, we're looking at utilities, we're looking at economic development and equity and transit and transportation and agriculture and land use cover, and the list goes on. And we're trying to put all of those together in a coherent picture and then achieve a target. And the target piece is complicated and tricky and has been evolving a lot. And so I'm going to try and give you a snapshot on where targets are at, what's the best practice in target setting right now, and we can think about how that feeds into our subsequent discussions. If you go to the next slide, on August 9th, an organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 5-year assessment of the state of climate science. And so every 5 years, they've been mandated by the United Nations to say, where are we at in terms of climate change? They issue 3 reports. The first report is on the state of science. The second report is on mitigation pathways. So how do we stop climate change? And the third report is on adaptation. So they've only released the first one, which is the state of science, after 5 years. So this was a really pivotal report that I think is very influential in everyone who's working on climate. And it didn't paint a pretty picture. I'm sure most of you saw some news coverage of this report, but this is a headline from New York Times. Some devastating impacts of global warming are now unavoidable, but there is still a short window to stop things from getting worse. So they didn't tell us what that window or what that pathway looks like exactly. And we will get that in February of next year when they release their second report. But they did give us a sense in a report that they issued 2 years ago or 3 years ago now on what we would need to do if we were going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So that 1.5 degrees, if you go to the next slide, is the key goal from the UN Paris Accord. And the Paris Accord is important because it represents a global effort to address climate change. And climate change is an issue that if you don't address it globally, you're kind of stuck because everyone needs to work together. So Paris Accord is the framework for doing that. Within the Paris Accord, almost every country in the world has now signed on to it. It is an interesting framework because unlike previous versions of UN climate negotiations, it allows each country to set its own target. And these are called nationally determined commitments. So in previous versions, countries were told what their target had to be, and that resulted in rebellion by all sorts of countries. So in this version in Paris, the breakthrough in the Paris negotiations was to say, okay, you go back home, you figure out what you can do in your country, keep consideration of the target of staying within 2 degrees warming, ideally 1.5 degrees warming, and propose what you're going to do. And so all the countries have been doing that. All the G7 countries right now have a target of net zero emissions by 2050, and that's what the current sort of, I guess, consensus is on what the targets need to be, is net zero by 2050. You'll see that everywhere. Pretty much everyone is adopting net zero by 2050. If you go to the next slide, the tricky part is that the current targets that we have are not sufficient to limit warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, which are the safe thresholds. So the current policies are that blue bar. This is Climate Action Tracker, which assesses all the countries' targets globally. They say we're in 2.7 to 3.1 degrees range, and this is after the US just announced its recent targets. So it includes those. And you can see the yellow bar and the green bar is where we actually need to be. So there's a big gap between where the world is currently aiming and where we need to get if we're going to limit warming to that level. If you go to the next slide, at the level of cities, there's a lot of action. And cities, I think, have more ambitious and more serious targets than most countries. And there's a number of different bodies that cities join. There's the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is sort of the international body of, that includes over 10,000 cities around the world who've committed to climate action. There's the Race to Zero, which is a campaign in the lead up to the Glasgow climate negotiations this fall that 1,000 cities have committed to ambitious targets on. So basically, it's become very fashionable to have an ambitious GHG target for most cities around the world now. And most of them are using net zero as their sort of baseline. And if you look at the communities around there, like Des Moines is at net zero by 2050 with an interim target of 45% by 2030. Iowa City is at net zero by 2050. Sioux Falls, It's at net zero by 2050, similar with many municipalities in Wisconsin. So net zero by 2050 is kind of where everyone is at. It gets a little more tricky when you get to the 2030 target, the interim target. A lot of people in your neck of the woods have gone with 45% by 2030 reduction. So almost sort of cutting their emissions in half by 2030 is more or less the average reduction level. For the first time ever, if you go to the next slide, there's actually a guide on what targets cities should be setting to align with 1.5 or 2 degrees. And this guide was prepared by C40. C40 is the network of global cities who are active on climate change. This is New York, Paris, Los Angeles, Toronto, Tokyo, etc. So all the big cities who are cooperating on climate action. That's the C40 organization. Global Covenant of Mayors is that sort of any city who wants to step up to take action. CDP is a reporting platform. ICLEI was already discussed. And then WRI is a sort of research institute, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with WWF. So they jointly published this guide, and it gives a roadmap for setting targets. So it's really handy because it takes some of the mystery or discussion out of targets, but the targets that it has within it are very aggressive. So it's saying like 60 to 70% or more by 2030 reductions. So very ambitious. If you imagine like removing that amount of emissions from Ames, you'd be talking about a completely different energy system in 10 years. So it's a fairly radical transformation. So that gives you sort of an overview of where targets are at, where other municipalities are at. It's usually targeting zero emissions or net zero emissions by 2050 and cutting your emissions in half by 2030. And I expect that those targets will become more ambitious when the next IAPCC report comes out in February. So because all of the signs are that we're really running out of time to prevent dangerous climate change. So what we do then is typically municipalities will establish a target that lines up with other municipalities. This was a discussion you guys were having earlier. And then, or aligns up with science-based objectives. And then we'll model pathways to try and get there. And often we'll have a gap. We call it emissions gap or whatever, where we don't quite achieve the target. And because we're modeling out till 2050, there's opportunity for new technologies or new interventions that we might not anticipate yet to fill that gap going forward. So I don't think, at least I would say it's not critical that the pathway that we model has to achieve the target. We want to get as close as we can, but we can, at least in many other projects, we often have a gap, recognizing that there's still new technologies or new approaches that will come on board to help solve that gap. And so all of that pathway and that target then feeds into the climate action plan. The other reason the target is important is it really helps us formulate the actions. And so we will develop the actions with the community and with you, and then model them and then say, okay, they don't go quite far enough, then we'll iterate or adjust the approach until we sort of align with the target as closely as we can. So as Naomi mentioned, the target is kind of a North Star that helps guide the development of actions. So that's another reason why it is useful to identify a target earlier on. And I think that is it for now, for me. That's a whole, you guys are getting a ton of information tonight, so I must apologize for, hopefully we haven't overwhelmed you.
Thank you. Questions?
I have one question. What is encompassed in high-level financials?
Right. So as Eric mentioned, we track the stocks of a lot of things. So cars, for example, in cars, we will track the capital cost of purchasing new cars at the natural turnover rate out until 2050 in Ames. Then we'll track the capital cost of switching, for example, if this is an action, all of those purchases to electric vehicles. And that means, for example, there's an incremental cost for electric vehicles in the next 10 years, and then electric vehicles are projected to be more or less the same as gasoline vehicles. So the incremental cost disappears. So we'll track that capital cost in both of those two scenarios that I just described. Then we'll also track the operating cost of those cars. So how much people would spend on gasoline in one scenario or diesel, and then how much they would spend on electricity in the other scenario. So we actually track a lot of financial indicators. It gives you a really good picture of expenditures in specific sectors in the community. And those are really useful for economic development. For example, you could say how much money is likely to be spent on heat pumps for the next 10 years under this scenario. And that then talk to HVAC contractors, they're very happy to see those kind of numbers. Or you might track how much money is going to be spent on new construction in the next 10 years or 15 years. And developers or builders are very interested in those numbers. So it actually gives you a lot of really interesting economic indicators that can support economic development or new businesses in their business planning exercises.
So
Does that help you?
Yes, that helps. I've got a follow-up question to that then. So at what point, if at all, does the question of environmental justice communities come into this, or social justice communities, any of those low to moderate income communities that could be adversely impacted by expensive changes that could be imposed on them? Is that factored in somehow in the modeling, or I don't know.
I think it's factored in 3 different ways. So in the first way, in the modeling, we do track the impact on specific households. So if we know, for example, there's a lot of low-income households in certain areas, we can look at the impact on their household energy expenditures and how much they would invest to make these whatever actions we identify happen. So that's one level. The second level is the way in which we design actions. So we can think about, for example, targeting actions to particular households or particular communities or neighborhoods to advance equity objectives. And then, I don't know, I know there's 3, but I forget what the third one is. So two for now.
Well, if I may add something to that too, I would say that these are exactly the kinds of considerations that we would want in the engagement process, from the committee as well, to tell us where to look, too. Like, we can look ourselves, but if it's an objective that already exists, or an area that we already know that Ames wants to work on, that's something that we would want to know so that we could make sure we model, and then the recommendations policy-wise too, coming out of that reflect that as well.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions. So many of the cities that are involved in this larger group are cities that are growing at phenomenal rates. Ames has a projection of growing by 15,000 people by 2040. So a much smaller level of growth, but still, how do we think about growing the community and yet also being able to achieve meaningful reductions in our carbon footprint? Is that possible to answer?
Yeah. So we certainly work with lots of communities in that situation. And so 14,000 isn't insignificant growth rate. I think that's a fair amount of new population, which means new homes, new vehicles, which means more energy consumption. And so depending on what type of energy is consumed, that could increase your emissions or not. So I think really the question is, how do you make that growth as efficient as possible? So use as little energy as possible. There's all sorts of ways to do that. And then any energy that is required to make sure that it's clean. So I think that's the basic formulation to deal with growth.
And can you give us, we've been speaking at fairly abstract terms tonight, and could you give us just a couple of examples of the types of techniques that cities are using in the cities you've consulted with to try to reduce their carbon footprint?
In general, or in particular for growth?
I mean, just in general, and not that this is committing us to any of them, but just to give us a sense. I mean, this is all very high level. I think it'd be helpful just to get a sense of, here are 2 or 3 things that cities are doing that might be involved with a city like Ames.
Yeah, our retrofit program. So often a city will partner with utilities and others, and maybe a construction industry to develop a very systematic and ambitious building retrofit program, often starting with low-income households, for example, and then spreading beyond. Another, on the growth side, are requiring certain levels of GHG performance for new construction. And there's all sorts of interesting ways to finance that so it doesn't really cost anything more for the developer or for the home builder. Lots of different strategies on transportation to support EV uptake or active transportation. And I think Ames is already engaged in a number of those activities. So it could just be a matter of scaling them up or perhaps reorienting them. On energy, supporting renewable energy generation, both at the commercial level, for example, on commercial buildings or on industrial sites, so particular locations that don't have a lot of other value, or on residential homes, and scaling that up as well. So a lot of it is really scaling up existing activities, I would say, in general.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you. And the final one, I mentioned the topic of carbon sequestration, and many publications like The Economist magazine have talked about that we've just gone too far in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the environment, and that if we're truly going to be able to reach some of these goals, it's going to have to include sequestration, and there's a lot of focus being done on R&D on sequestration and trying to find even commercial applications, agricultural methods of sequestration. When you work with cities, does sequestration have a role in this, or is sequestration really something that's being done on state or federal level?
It depends on the city and how much the land base of that city. So there's, I think, 4 or 5 different sequestration moves. Like there's increased forest cover as one move. There's the overall land use change. So if you're experiencing a lot of growth, then potentially you're going to lose sequestration, and managing that can be an important move from carbon sequestration. Then there's also agricultural practices, which you mentioned, if that's included within the boundary. And then there's also wetlands can also be a sequestration move. And then there's like the carbon dioxide removals, which could happen through technologies. And that's, I would say, still a bit of a long shot. It's not a proven technology yet, but some people are starting to explore that. And there's also in-ground carbon sequestration. So putting CO2 into the ground, and that's an expensive approach, but there are, like Edmonton, for example, which is an oil and gas hub we worked with, is exploring that right now. So some cities are looking at that, but that's like a much more expensive project.
Thank you. These are all very good answers.
Other questions?
I have one other question. To what extent do the recommendations focus on city policies as opposed to the modes of energy production or the use of energy by our citizens? How much of this is going to help us to readjust what we might be doing in our policy setting?
So the modeling itself doesn't look at policies, it looks at the physical transition of the community. And on top, that then gives us all sorts of clues as to what type of policies would be required. And then we get into sort of what jurisdiction or powers does the municipality have to influence these things. In some cases, it may be none. It may be about partnerships or incentives or education. In other cases, there may be direct policies that can be applied. And that's sort of a mapping process. How do we influence this thing, and what's the best way that the city or its partners might be able to do that? And that's what the whole implementation phase is about, is figuring out how to translate this energy transformation into levers that the city can pull.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great questions.
David, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Anybody else? All right, I think we've got questions on this segment completed. Is there any other segments tonight?
There are not, so we'll just wrap up at this point.
Okay.
So as you've heard,
yeah, someone's question.
Yeah.
Actually, tonight it's just council asking questions. You will have the opportunity to ask questions when you meet with the consultants. So I hope you're writing questions down. Our thought was if we start having audience questions, we'll probably go into a much longer time period. So we're just trying to set the case. So I hate to shut you off, but hold that question. I'm sure you can ask it, and they'd love to answer it for you. Okay. Thank you. Please.
Great. So as you've heard today, we're deep in the modeling process and just about to kick off our extensive engagement plan with the Supplemental Input Committee and the broader public. You got a sneak peek of the website we'll be using as one of those methods, along with hosting a town hall. And some of that engagement will happen over the next 2 months. The next time we'll see you is in mid-November. I believe November 16th is the date we have on the calendar. And at that point, we're going to plan on diving deep into our initial modeling results and designing those low carbon actions. So those are our next immediate steps. We certainly appreciate your time and dedication to tonight's meeting. I agree, it was a lot of information to absorb, but great to set the groundwork, I think, for all of us to kick off this effort. So from myself and the SSG team, thank you very much, and excited to continue this work.
Deb, are you looking for, or is there a team looking for any kind of direction from council tonight?
Yeah, specific to the engagement plan, if there were any changes or revisions or additional input that you would like the plan to reflect, now is the time to do that.
Well, I think the mayor has brought up a really important point tonight about the role of Iowa State. And I don't have any specific suggestions other than perhaps maybe Mayor, you reaching out to the Iowa State leadership and saying, look, this is what we're doing. To what degree do you want to have a part of this? Because I thought your points were very salient, and to be successful, we have to engage Iowa State in this process. So that would be a suggestion. I don't know that that requires a formal change in the policy. Maybe it does, but.
Steve, you have a comment on that?
No.
Okay. I wonder if maybe Mary and I could, and Steve and Deb could probably engage with ISU leadership and explain the situation. And actually, I asked Steve this question. He made a good point. Is there's actually a lot of stakeholders that aren't really here around the table. That is residents, it's commercial entities as well too. I thought of Iowa State from the standpoint that they're doing some major projects, but I think it's good to challenge the team to be thinking, how can we get those individuals at the table? But I certainly will. Mary, you and I can email, and Deb, we can just kind of connect, and Steve, maybe we do have periodic meetings with Dr. Winterstein and her team, and we might just go ahead and call for a special one and just talk about it and make sure they're up to, not that you haven't kept them up to speed, but
Sure.
just make sure we're on the same page. So I might just mention, and I don't know if there's a motion, but Councilmember Betcher brought up a really good point, and that is, the underrepresented, under-resourced are very, very hard, to get feedback from, and they could be really impacted significantly by, you mentioned social justice, you mentioned some of the potential goals, and we don't have a category in our 12 groups specifically for that segment of our population. So consequently, I guess I would just maybe suggest that be talked about, and how is that outreach going to be undertaken, and it's a very challenging group because we don't get much from council from that's, and they're busy, they probably have multiple jobs and they have kids, and they're very challenged, and we're very, very sensitive. Not that others don't have challenges also, but the point being is that I think that's one thing that I think I heard a common theme that maybe I would just suggest you think about.
So there are two of the community sectors that our intent would reach out and help represent the underrepresented individuals, and that would be the nonprofit and civic representation, which we have two, and the faith-based community. And of course, then we've got the citizens at large and the Ames City residents as well. So, and I think through our meetings with the community input group, we can continue carrying that message and asking representatives, actually from all of those sectors, but specifically those that I mentioned, to be reaching out and touching those individuals in those underrepresented areas. So we are getting that voice. And I think, again, through our activities and some of our engagement plans, that we can specify those areas that we need to do extra outreach in, so we get that input and help them be a part of this plan.
given the fact that the consultant's been hired to set the course, and I think that we rely on consultants to do their job. I don't know that necessarily have to have a motion to approve your plan. I think council's made it, I sense a lot of support for what you're doing, and thank you for doing that. So anything else that anyone else like to add? Well, thank you. And also, just as a side note, I'm just proud of the city of Ames and what we've done over the past 40 years in the fields of energy conservation, sustainability. The partnership with Mary has been, phenomenal in terms of what we're doing. Everything from Rummage Rampage to you name it. But Deb, can you just comment on how the word's going to be getting out, or is going to be, how you're going to get that out? Because I think people need to realize this is not something we're just starting from ground zero. We're actually, this is in my mind, it's just another step in the commitment that the city of Ames has to sustainability and working together with our partnership with our electric department, resource recovery plant, first in the nation, 40 years ago, and then also with Iowa State. So can you just comment on that for a minute?
Sure. So sustainability has been, I think, an underlying commitment of the cities, and certainly is a value of councils. And we've done a variety of things over the years. I mean, something as simple as the recycling of glass, and we've got food waste diversion. We've got the EV chargers that we're helping to make available around the community, the biodiesel swap in fuel for our snowplow trucks. Just a variety of those things. We've primarily been promoting that through the city's sustainability webpage. And I think now with the activation of the website for the climate action plan, that's going to build off of our sustainability webpage. So we should be getting more traffic on that page. And that's certainly going to be the one-stop shop to get the information. But I know Susan's worked really hard on making sure that information's available and that we keep it up to date. And I think going through this climate action planning process will certainly elevate those kinds of things that we've been doing recently. The SunSmart, the solar farm, that's a big effort, and that continues to grow. So stay tuned, and all of us can help promote those efforts.
Well, it might be too on the website that SSG is putting together. Maybe you have a hot link button that would just say, "What are we currently doing?" Because I think just to kind of be able to see that, because I just don't think that we need to champion and trumpet. And maybe if Iowa State has one that says, "Here's what we're doing," have a hot link button to that, because then they can just say, "Hey, we are already doing things. We want to just build upon that."
Yep. And there are a couple of links already, the city into Iowa State at the end of, towards the bottom of the Climate Action Plan website. So we'll continue marrying those two sites together so people have all the information that's available at their fingertips.
Well, thank you very much. And everyone who attended, we greatly appreciate you being here and being partners with us. You're going to play a key role. And what I'm going to do, council, is we have one disposition and communication to council. I'm going to just have council comments first. If you want to share anything with either the audience, then we'll pick up disposition and communication to council before we adjourn. I'll start with you, Gloria. Any comments?
I'm very excited about this kickoff and seeing the engagement plan. It does occur to me that we may have an opportunity to promote some of that engagement at the Play Ames Engagement Festival that's going to be coming up on Saturday, September 25th, which has the potential to reach some of our underrepresented communities in town. That's one of the reasons we're doing that. So it's something that could be considered. And I hope all of you will consider showing up for our festival. There will be information coming out from the Community and Regional Planning Department at Iowa State from the team that's organizing it. That's all I've got.
Tim?
Yeah, I echo Gloria's comment. This is an exciting new chapter for us. The world has watched Afghanistan fall apart, and this is not something that we as city council members comment on. Generally, we don't talk about world events typically, but I am very pleased that in Iowa we have made a commitment to accept refugees from Afghanistan, and I hope that Ames will be able to host some of these people to give them a fresh start. So heavy for tremendous challenges for this country coming ahead. I hope we can help a little bit in our own way.
Thank you. Rachel?
Yeah, I would just echo what's been said. I think this is a great kickoff and introduction to the Climate Action Plan. I'm really excited to see where we go from here, and I want to thank everyone who's watching and involved here as well. We could use all the input that we can get, so thank you.
Thank you. Amber, anything?
Agree. Tonight was very informative, and I'm looking forward to the next meeting. And I just want to thank all of you who have volunteered to serve on the supplemental committee.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I would just echo their thanks, and glad we're getting started with this process. It does seem like it takes a long time, but I mean, better start sooner rather than later. And so I'm glad we're getting going on it. It is important. And the latest reports we've seen, I mean, there is no time to lose. So thank you all again, too.
Trevor?
Yes, just two things. One, I just wanted to say I want to do my best to get student input on this topic. I know that there's a lot of people who care about it from what I've heard, and really they just need the information. So I'll use my resources to the best of my ability. And then kind of unrelated, I just wanted to say now that the Student Senate is back in session, I will start bringing up some projects in the next couple of weeks. So that's all I have.
Thanks. David?
Thanks to SSG for joining us tonight. I think this was a great start, and thanks to the liaison team for putting all this together. This is really good stuff. No other comments tonight.
Thanks. And I'll just mention too, again, on the input committee, all you are here, I think we had over 50 people who submitted applications, and it was not an easy process to winnow through it, but I think it just represents Ames is really engaged and really cares about what goes on in our community. And to think that we have 27 or 28 people that are going to be working together with us to go out and contact your different groups and find out, get feedback. I just think it's outstanding. And instead of saying, can you please come and help, or try and beg people and try and get 5 or 10, we have 27 people that are committed to doing that. I know it's going to take time, but boy, we're just looking forward to that whole process. And I too am excited about this, finally getting going. It's going to take time, but the point is we want to create a plan that is workable and attainable, and not just something that we put on the shelf and just say, well, we did it, we checked the box, and we're moving on. So when I ask questions, I'll just ask questions. It's not that we're trying to pick things apart. We also make sure that we get something that we can really implement and make a real difference, in our community. And we've demonstrated that for many, many years. So anyway, so thank you. And we'll move on to disposition of communication to council. Council, we have one letter, or we have one email that was for consideration. Is there any motion on that? Regarding the traffic study, I believe it was.
All right.
Mayor, I would move that we contact the person who is interested in this and say that we don't feel we're interested in pursuing that at this time, but that we have noted the
Concern.
situation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Second.
All right, move second. Those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. All right.
Mayor.
But- I was trying to cut it short at 10 minutes before 8. Go ahead, Deb.
I can talk fast. There was no vote on the motion to accept the engagement plan.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we didn't need one.
Move to accept the engagement plan.
Okay.
Second.
Oh, wait a minute. Who's running this meeting? Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstaining? All right. Very good. Talked fast. Very good. All right. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
We are adjourned. Thank you.